Hello there, I'm Rachel Hahn. I'm a copy editor and staff writer with Model Aviation Magazine, and we are conducting a series of video interviews about the AMA government affairs situation and the work that AMA is doing for that. I have with me Rich Hanson. He is the director of AMA Government and Regulatory Affairs. He is going to explain to us a little bit about the FAA's interpretation of the special rule for model aircraft. Now, we are coming up on the deadline for that. The deadline is September 23rd for you to make comments on this interpretation of the rule. So we would like to know how our modelers can make these comments, how important is it for them to submit their comments, and what do they need to know to submit their comments on the interpretation?
Sure. Good morning, Rachel. Yeah, we are in the last few days of the public comment period for FAA's interpretation of the special rule for model aircraft. And I think it's important to just give a little bit of background information of how we got to where we are today, remembering that model aircraft have been operating in the national airspace environment for well over 100 years, since the turn of the 20th century. And for the most part, model aircraft operated seamlessly and harmoniously within our communities for decades without any type of oversight or regulatory involvement. The first time the FAA even speaks to model aircraft is in an old advisory circular that was published in 1981 that just basically gave some general safety guidelines in terms of finding a safe place to fly, prove your aircraft before flying in front of spectators, stay below 5 feet. If you're within 3 miles of an airport, letting them know you're there. It also talks about not interfering with manned aircraft. And model aircraft continue to operate under this old advisory circular and more importantly under AMA safety code well into the 1990s and early 2000s, when the unmanned aircraft technology really started to blossom in our defense industry. In 2007, the FAA published a notice in the Federal Register that basically said there was only 3 ways you could operate an unmanned aircraft within the national airspace. One is to be a model aircraft and fly by the old advisory circular. The other is to be a public aircraft and operate by what's called a certificate of authorization. Or if you're a commercial operator, you need to get what's called a special airworthiness certificate in the experimental category. Okay. Now that actually got the FAA started on creating regulations for unmanned aircraft. They formed an aviation rulemaking committee in 2008, which we were part of. That committee submitted its recommendations to the FAA in 2009. And from that point forward, the FAA started writing true regulations to integrate the small unmanned aircraft into the national airspace. That approach took us down sort of a 2-path approach, the idea being that there was the majority of model aircraft that are flown within what's called a community-based organization such as AMA, and a few model aircraft operators who choose to operate independently outside of any organization. And the ARC recommendation established that those operations within the community-based organization should stay within that organization, and those that operate outside of that should be governed by whatever regulations come out of the regulatory process. The idea of creating a separate set of standards for the community-based operation actually led us down a path that was creating a very in-depth and involved set of standards that we felt were going to be onerous and a little bit cumbersome, if not greatly cumbersome, for the modeling community. So in 2010, we approached Congress and asked them to consider creating some legislative guidelines on how model aircraft will be operated. And in 2012, they actually created the special rule for model aircraft that was published as part of the FAA Modernization Reform Act of 2012. Okay.
So what would you say actually led to this special rule for model aircraft being established?
Well, as I said, it was in large part to the congressional campaign that we put together in 2010, and it was Congress's response and actually recognition of the excellent safety record that model aircraft in the modeling aircraft community had achieved over the decades it's been operating. And they felt it was important to exempt and to separate them from the regulations that are going forward for the total UAS community.
Okay. Well, what would you say was Congress's intention in establishing this special rule for model aircraft, and what does it mean to modelers today?
Well, it means a lot to the modelers today. This actually was a protection from the regulation. It was truly intended to exempt model aircraft that are operated within a community-based organization like AMA from additional regulation and onerous regulation for the UAS community. It recognized the safe work that the modelers had done, and provided that the community-based organization could continue to manage that activity within the future. Now, when you look at the special rule itself, it's important to look at a few things, and the one that strikes you right off the bat in the very first paragraph is the fact that it prohibits the FAA from creating any rule or regulation regarding a model aircraft, or an aircraft being developed as a model aircraft, such as manufacturing aircraft and aircraft that are being distributed through the marketing and retail process. That was probably the single area that we feel is most problematic about the interpretive rule, because it is just that, a rule, which by congressional act is prohibited in terms of the FAA promulgating any rule regarding model aircraft. We also see that the interpretive rule is a legislative rule, because it actually creates new regulation that model aircraft have never been subject to in the past, and the FAA, by its own actions, have not held model aircraft accountable to those. So we feel that it is not only contrary to the congressional intent, but it also is not compliant with the Administrative Procedures Act that requires a total comment and rule process. And then when you get into the special rule itself, it talks about some very simple criteria that model aircraft should follow in addition to the rules set forward by the community-based organization. It sets up some very simple rules about not interfering with manned aircraft, seeing and avoiding at all times, operating within visual line of sight. It also talks about flying for hobby and recreational purposes. The special rule was very straightforward. It is in plain English and plain language, and we feel that it does not need further interpretation.
Okay. All right. Well, everyone, remember that September 23rd is the deadline to submit your comments for the FAA's interpretation of the special rule for model aircraft. And I want to thank Rich Hanson for all this helpful information today. If you want to learn more about AMA's government and regulatory affairs and the work the AMA is doing to help save your right to fly, visit www.modelaircraft.org/gov. There you can find blog posts, other videos, and other helpful information.